Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. One of the most uncomfortable truths about the war in Ukraine is also one of the least openly discussed. It's not just that Russia invaded a sovereign country. It's not just that the war has dragged on far longer than many expected. It's the reason why the United States and NATO have drawn very clear limits on how far they're willing to go. Those limits are not primarily about money. They're not about public opinion alone. They're not even about military capability. They are about nuclear weapons. Once you acknowledge that a second, even more uncomfortable question naturally follows. Did Ukraine make a catastrophic mistake when it gave up its nuclear weapons in the 1990s? That question makes a lot of people uneasy, especially in the West. It sounds dangerous. It sounds like it undermines decades of non-proliferation efforts. And politically, it feels almost taboo to say out loud. But strategically, that's a question that simply refuses to go away. Let's start with what we can clearly observe today. Russia is a nuclear-armed state. And because it is a nuclear-armed state, it enjoys a level of strategic immunity that no conventional military power can fully overcome. The United States has supplied Ukraine with enormous amounts of aid financially, militarily, and politically. But it has also been extremely careful. There are red lines everywhere. No direct NATO troops, no no-fly zone. No strikes launched from NATO territory. Weapons arrive gradually, often after long internal debates. Even now, everything is calibrated. Why? Because escalation with a nuclear power carries risks that no responsible government is willing to fully accept. This isn't about cowardice. It's not about moral weakness. It's about deterrence. Nuclear weapons don't need to be used to work. Their entire function is to make others hesitate, to inject uncertainty, to raise the cost of intervention beyond what even powerful states are willing to pay. In that sense, Russia's nuclear arsenal has already done its job. It has not protected Russia from economic sanctions. It has not prevented international condemnation. But it has absolutely constrained the military options of Ukraine's allies. Once you see that clearly historical parallel becomes unavoidable. In the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine found itself in possession of the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal. Thousands of nuclear warheads were deployed on its territory. On paper, Ukraine was suddenly one of the most heavily armed nuclear states on Earth. Did it last long? Under intense pressure from the United States, Russia, and the international community, Ukraine agreed to give up those weapons. In exchange, it received security assurances under the Budapest Memorandum. The agreement promised respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It promised that force would not be used against it. What it did not promise was automatic military protection. At the time, this seemed reasonable. The Cold War had just ended. Nuclear disarmament was seen as a moral and strategic victory. The idea that Russia would one day launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine felt distant, even absurd. In hindsight, the calculation looks very different, because when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, those security assurances didn't translate into military action. When Russia launched a full invasion in 2022, they still didn't. What Ukraine received instead was support but conditional support, significant but limited, powerful but restrained, which brings us back to the uncomfortable core question. If Ukraine had retained nuclear weapons, would Russia have invaded? We can't answer that with absolute certainty. History doesn't run controlled experiments, but we can analyze incentives, behavior, and precedent. Nuclear deterrence works by threatening unacceptable costs. A nuclear-armed Ukraine wouldn't need to match Russia warhead for warhead. It would only need to credibly threaten damage that Russia's leadership could not ignore. That alone would have changed Moscow's risk calculation dramatically. It's hard to imagine a scenario in which Russia launches a conventional invasion of a nuclear-armed neighbor without extreme hesitation. Even if it believed Ukraine would never use those weapons, the uncertainty itself would be destabilizing. And this is where the logic becomes uncomfortable for people who prefer idealistic explanations. The reason NATO doesn't directly intervene in Ukraine today is not because Ukraine lacks moral legitimacy. It's because Russia has nuclear weapons. If that's true now, it was likely true then.
So yes, at the level of pure deterrence logic, it is reasonable to argue that Ukraine's decision to give up its nuclear arsenal removed the single most powerful constraint on Russian aggression.
That doesn't mean Ukraine's leaders were foolish. It doesn't mean they acted irrationally. They were operating in a completely different world, with different assumptions and enormous pressure. But it does mean that the long-term consequences of that decision were devastating.
Now, before we go further, it's important to address a common counterargument.
Some people respond by saying Ukraine didn't really have nuclear weapons. They were Soviet weapons. Ukraine didn't control them.
There's truth to that, but it's not the whole truth. Ukraine may not have had full operational control at the time, but control is not a static condition.
It's something that can be developed, negotiated, and consolidated over time. Other states have done exactly that under far more difficult circumstances.
The more important point is this: Ukraine wasn't asked to delay disarmament.
It was asked to abandon nuclear capability entirely.
And once that capability was gone, it was gone forever.
Another counterargument is even more serious and deserves to be taken seriously. Would a nuclear-armed Ukraine have been stable? Could it have safely maintained a credible deterrent? Would internal political instability, economic collapse, or corruption have increased the risk of accidents or unauthorized use?
These are legitimate concerns.
Nuclear weapons are not just tools of deterrence. They are enormous responsibilities. And it's entirely possible that a newly independent, economically fragile Ukraine would have struggled to manage a nuclear arsenal safely in the 1990s. But here's the hard truth.
The risk of mismanagement is hypothetical. The risk of invasion turned out to be real. In strategic analysis, outcomes matter.
And the outcome we're living with now is a war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed cities, destabilized Europe, and reshaped global geopolitics. It's also important to understand why the West pushed so hard for Ukrainian disarmament in the first place.
This wasn't just about Ukraine.
It was about the global non-proliferation regime. The fear was that if Ukraine kept nuclear weapons, other post-Soviet states might follow. The nuclear order would fragment, control would weaken, risks would multiply. From a global perspective, that concern made sense, but from Ukraine's perspective, the cost-benefit calculation was radically different. Ukraine traded away the ultimate guarantee of sovereignty in exchange for political assurances that had no enforcement mechanism.
That trade-off has now been tested, and it failed. This doesn't mean nuclear disarmament is inherently foolish.
But it does mean that disarmament without enforceable security guarantees is dangerously fragile. And here's where the implications go far beyond Ukraine. A lesson other countries are learning from this war is not subtle. They are watching a non-nuclear state get invaded by a nuclear state.
They are watching security assurances fail. They are watching intervention stop at the nuclear threshold.
And they are drawing conclusions. The most dangerous of those conclusions is this: if you want to prevent invasion, nuclear weapons work. That is an extraordinarily damaging lesson for the international system. It undermines decades of efforts to limit nuclear proliferation. It encourages hedging behavior. It tells medium and small states that treaties and promises are not enough. This is not theoretical. Policymakers in Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere are already debating it.
The tragedy is that Ukraine did everything the international community asked of it, and still ended up fighting for its survival.
Now, let's address a question that often comes up in American discussions.
Would the United States have behaved differently if Ukraine were nuclear armed? Almost certainly.
Not because America is cruel or cynical, but because the entire strategic framework would change. Nuclear-armed Ukraine would not be treated as a conventional prox. It would be treated as a direct participant in nuclear deterrence dynamics. That alone would have reshaped diplomatic and military planning. In other words, nuclear weapons don't just deter enemies. They change how allies behave too.
Which brings us back to the present. Now, the United States is extremely cautious. It wants Ukraine to survive. It wants Russia to fail.
But it does not want a direct confrontation between nuclear powers.
That balancing act defines everything. It explains why aid is substantial but limited.
Why escalation is managed, not pursued. Why winning is never clearly defined.
And this is why claims like, if only the US had given more, Ukraine would have won, miss the deeper point.
The limiting factor has never been American capability. It has been nuclear risk.
That risk exists precisely because Russia is nuclear armed, and Ukraine is not. This isn't an argument for nuclear weapons as a moral good. It's an argument for understanding how power actually works in the world we live in. The uncomfortable reality is that nuclear weapons create a hierarchy of security.
States that have them play by different rules. States that must rely on alliances and promises that can weaken under pressure. Ukraine's experience is a brutal illustration of that fact. So when people say Ukraine giving up nuclear weapons was a mistake, they are not necessarily advocating proliferation. They are pointing to a structural failure in the international system.
A system that asked a vulnerable country to disarm, promised protection, and then stopped short when that protection became dangerous to provide. That contradiction hasn't been resolved, it's been exposed, and until it is resolved, the world should expect more countries, not fewer, to question whether disarmament actually makes them safer. That is the long shadow of this war. And it's a shadow that won't disappear when the fighting stops.